They say home is where the heart is. But what happens when your own heart is locked out of the place you built with your bare hands? My name is Victoria, and at 68 years old, I thought I had learned all of life's cruel lessons. I was wrong. Standing in front of my own beach house, fumbling with keys that no longer fit, I felt something break inside me that had nothing to do with locks or doors. The salty breeze that once welcomed me home now felt like a slap across my weathered face. Through the window I had installed myself, saving money by watching YouTube tutorials and refusing to hire contractors. I could see my son Daniel moving around what used to be my living room, where I had rocked him to sleep as a baby when his father decided fatherhood was too much responsibility. The medical trip to the city had been necessary. The doctors found a small tumor that required immediate attention, and for 6 weeks, I lived in uncertainty, facing each procedure alone because Daniel was too busy with work to accompany me. I understood, I told myself. Young families have obligations. I had raised him to be responsible, hadn't I? Even when responsibility meant leaving your mother to face cancer scares in sterile hospital rooms, counting ceiling tiles instead of holding a familiar hand. But I survived. The tumor was benign, and I drove my old Honda back to the coast with a heart full of gratitude and longing for the peace of my little sanctuary. I had spent 20 years building this life after my divorce. 20 years of scraped knees from laying tile, paint-stained clothes from doing my own repairs, and the deep satisfaction of creating something beautiful with my own determination. Every board, every nail, every carefully chosen paint color was a testament to my ability to start over when everything fell apart. The house sat on a small dune overlooking the ocean, modest but perfect. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, and a living room with windows that captured every sunset. I had bought the land when it was considered worthless, too close to the water, too far from town. But I saw potential where others saw problems, just like I had seen potential in a scared young man when I married him, before he decided my love wasn't enough to keep him faithful. If you enjoy emotional stories like this one, please subscribe to our channel. We're working toward 1,000 subscribers, and your support means everything to our work. And please comment with what city you're watching from. The first sign something was wrong came when my key wouldn't turn. I stood there, grocery bags cutting into my palms, thinking the salt air had corroded the mechanism. It happens near the ocean. Everything needs constant maintenance, constant attention. Like relationships, I thought, not knowing how prophetic that comparison would prove to be. Then I saw movement through the curtains. My curtains. The ones I had sewn by hand because store-bought ones never fit quite right. A woman's silhouette, tall and sharp-angled, moving through my space with the confidence of ownership. My daughter-in-law, Rebecca, had always made me feel like an inconvenience in her perfect life. At family gatherings, she would redirect conversations away from my stories, suggest I might be more comfortable sitting in the corner, remind everyone how Daniel had outgrown his childhood home and needed space for his own family to flourish. I knocked. The sound echoed hollow against the door I had painted last spring, choosing a cheerful yellow because it reminded me of hope. Rebecca answered, and her expression held no surprise, no shame, no recognition that anything unusual was happening. She looked at me the way you might look at a door-to-door salesperson, politely annoyed, waiting for the interruption to end. "Victoria," she said, not moving aside to let me enter. Behind her, I could see my furniture rearranged, my photographs replaced with hers, my grandmother's quilt, the one that had covered 5 generations of women in my family, nowhere to be seen. "We need to talk." "About what?" I asked, though my heart was already sinking toward my stomach. The grocery bags felt heavier, the familiar weight of planning meals in my own kitchen suddenly foreign and uncertain. "About the house," Rebecca continued, her voice carrying the practiced tone of someone who had rehearsed this conversation. "Daniel and I have been discussing your situation, and we think it's time for some changes. You're getting older, and this place is too much for you to maintain. The stairs, the isolation, the distance from medical care, it's not safe." Safety. The word hung between us like a weapon disguised as concern. I had lived through a husband's betrayal, raised a child alone, survived cancer scares and hurricane seasons, and the thousand small disasters that teach a woman she's stronger than she ever imagined. But now, according to my son's wife, I was too fragile for the life I had built. "Where is Daniel?" I asked, my voice smaller than I intended. Surely my son, the boy I had taught to ride bicycles and tie shoes, the young man I had supported through college and marriage and the early struggles of starting his own family, would not hide behind his wife's skirts while they dismantled my existence. "He's inside," she said, still blocking the doorway. "We moved in last week. It makes more sense for everyone. The children need space to grow. And you need to think about your future more realistically. The children. My grandchildren, Emma and little Jack, who had always run to my arms when they visited, who helped me collect shells on the beach and listened to my stories about the old days when this stretch of coast was wild and undeveloped. Where were they now? Had they been told their grandmother was no longer welcome in the home where they had learned to love the ocean's rhythm? Through the window, I caught a glimpse of Daniel. He was sitting at my kitchen table, the one I had refinished during my first year here, stripping away years of neglect to reveal beautiful wood underneath. He was reading a newspaper, calm and comfortable, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. As if his mother standing locked out of her own home was just another ordinary Tuesday afternoon. That moment, standing on my own doorstep like a stranger, I understood that betrayal doesn't always come with shouting or dramatic confrontations. Sometimes it arrives quietly, dressed in practicality and concern, wearing the face of people you trusted with your heart. Sometimes the deepest cuts are made by those who know exactly where to find your soft spots, who understand that cruelty delivered with a smile hurts more than honest anger ever could. I had given everything to build this life, and in 6 weeks of medical absence, it had been redistributed like assets after a death. Except I was still alive, still breathing, still standing there with groceries I couldn't cook in my own kitchen, wondering how love had transformed so completely into indifference. The worst part wasn't the stolen house or the changed locks. It was the realization that while I had been fighting for my life in hospital beds, the people I loved most had been planning my exile, measuring my worth in square footage, and deciding I was no longer essential to their happiness. But I was still standing, still breathing, and somewhere deep inside, beneath the shock and heartbreak, something else was beginning to stir. Something that would teach them all the difference between a woman who can be discarded and a woman who chooses to disappear until the moment she decides to resurface. The conversation that followed felt like watching my own funeral while still breathing. Rebecca spoke about arrangements and what's best for everyone, as if I were a problem to be solved rather than a person whose entire world was crumbling. She had prepared answers for every protest I might raise, responses so polished they could only have come from weeks of planning. "We've already spoken to a lovely assisted living facility in town," she continued, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "They have activities, social programs, medical staff on site. You'll make friends your own age, people who understand what you're going through, what I was going through, as if grief were a phase to be managed rather than a response to betrayal. As if the loss of everything I had worked for could be cured with bingo games and supervised craft activities. "This is my home," I said, my voice shaking despite my efforts to stay calm. "I built this place. Every inch of it. You can't just—" "Actually, we can." Daniel's voice cut through the ocean breeze as he finally emerged from hiding behind his newspaper and his wife's skirts. My son, who had once been my whole world, looked at me with the distant politeness reserved for unwelcome visitors. "The house is in both our names now, Mom. You signed the papers yourself." The words hit me like a physical blow. I remembered signing documents during my medical crisis, papers that Rebecca had brought to the hospital with explanations about protecting assets and ensuring the family's security. I had been exhausted, scared, trusting my son to guide me through financial complexities I didn't understand. In my weakest moment, I had handed them the weapon they would use to destroy me. "You tricked me," I whispered, the full scope of their deception finally becoming clear. "You used my illness, my fear, to steal my home." Rebecca's expression didn't change. If anything, she looked slightly annoyed, as if my pain were an inconvenience she hadn't factored into her timeline. We didn't steal anything, Victoria. We secured the family's future. Property values are rising, and this house is worth considerably more than what you paid for it. It makes financial sense for the younger generation to take control now, while there's still time to maximize the investment. Investment. She spoke about my sanctuary, my refuge, my carefully crafted retirement dream, as if it were nothing more than numbers on a balance sheet. 20 years of memories reduced to market value and profit margins. What about my things? I asked, looking past them into what had been my living room. The furniture was gone, not just rearranged, but completely absent. The built-in shelves where I had displayed books and seashells and photographs of happier times stood empty, waiting for Rebecca's tasteful decorating choices to erase every trace of my existence. We donated most of it, Daniel said, his tone suggesting this had been a generous gesture rather than theft. Old furniture, outdated clothes, things that didn't fit with our lifestyle. The children needed space for their toys, and Rebecca has much better taste in home decor. My grandmother's rocking chair, where I had nursed Daniel through childhood fevers and read him bedtime stories, had been donated. The dining table where we had celebrated his birthdays and graduations, where I had helped him with homework and listened to his dreams about the future, was now cluttering some stranger's garage sale. The photo albums chronicling his entire life, from first steps to wedding day, had apparently been deemed outdated and discarded like yesterday's newspaper. You had no right, I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I knew how hollow they sounded. Legally, they had every right. I had given it to them myself, trusting that love would protect me from the very people I had sacrificed everything to raise and support. The neighbors had watched this systematic erasure of my life with the uncomfortable fascination people show for traffic accidents. Horrified but unable to look away, Mrs. Patterson from next door had always borrowed my gardening tools and invited me for coffee when the solitude became too heavy. Now she avoided eye contact when I walked past, as if poverty and displacement might be contagious. People are talking, Victoria, Rebecca said, following my gaze toward the neighboring houses, about an elderly woman living in her car, making the neighborhood look uncertain. It's not good for property values, and it's certainly not good for your reputation, my reputation, as if I were the one who should be ashamed. As if sleeping in my Honda because my own family had made me homeless was somehow more scandalous than the cruelty that had put me there. The children, my grandchildren, appeared briefly at the window. Emma, now 8, pressed her small hand against the glass for just a moment before Rebecca noticed and quickly closed the curtains. I wondered what story they had been told about why Grandma Victoria suddenly disappeared from their lives. Had they asked about the woman who used to make them pancakes shaped like sea creatures? Did they miss the bedtime stories about brave mermaids and kind whales that I had invented just for them? The facility has visiting hours, Daniel added, as if this were a generous concession rather than the bare minimum of human decency. Sundays from 2 to 4. You can see the kids then, under supervision. Supervised visits, with my own grandchildren. In my own son's voice, I heard the echo of every divorced father who had ever been reduced to scheduled access to his children's love. Except I had committed no crime beyond growing old and trusting the wrong people with my future. Over the following days, as I adjusted to sleeping in my car and washing in gas station bathrooms, I began to understand the full scope of their planning. This hadn't been a spontaneous decision born from my medical crisis. Rebecca had been researching assisted living facilities for months. Daniel had been consulting lawyers about property transfers and elder care options. They had built their trap carefully, waiting for the perfect moment when I would be too vulnerable to fight back effectively. The beach house glowed warmly in the evenings, its windows casting golden rectangles across the sand where I used to walk barefoot, collecting shells and planning garden improvements. Now I watched from my car as Rebecca redecorated my sanctuary, hanging different curtains, rearranging furniture that wasn't mine, creating a home that had no space for the woman who had made its existence possible. Friends from town began treating me differently. Some offered pity disguised as concern, speaking to me in the slow, careful tones people use with children or the mentally impaired. Others simply disappeared, avoiding the grocery store aisles where they might encounter my awkward presence. A few whispered behind cupped hands about family problems and difficult situations, as if my displacement were somehow my own fault. The worst moments came when I drove past the house at dinner time and saw them through the windows. Daniel, Rebecca, and the children seated around my kitchen table, sharing meals in the space where I had once felt most at peace. They looked like the perfect family, complete and content, as if my absence had actually improved their lives rather than destroyed mine. But late at night, when the tourists had gone home and the beach belonged only to the wind and the waves, I would sit in my car and remember who I used to be. Not just Daniel's mother or Rebecca's inconvenience, but Victoria Martinez, a woman who had survived divorce and single motherhood, who had built something beautiful from nothing, who had raised a son to believe in kindness and loyalty, and family bonds that couldn't be broken by convenience or greed. That woman was still in here somewhere, buried beneath layers of shock and grief, and the peculiar shame that comes from being discarded by people who once claimed to love you. And slowly, very slowly, she was beginning to wake up. The first time I tried to visit the children was a Sunday afternoon 3 weeks after my eviction. I had saved enough gas money to drive to town, bought small gifts from the dollar store, a coloring book for Emma and toy cars for Jack, and arrived at what used to be my front door exactly at 2 o'clock, as Daniel had specified. Rebecca answered wearing a designer dress that cost more than my monthly Social Security check. Her smile was practiced, the kind flight attendants use when delivering bad news about delayed departures. "Oh, Victoria," she said, as if my arrival were an unexpected inconvenience rather than a scheduled appointment. "I'm afraid the children aren't feeling well today. Stomach flu. Very contagious. You understand." Through the window, I could see Emma playing quietly in what used to be my living room, showing no signs of illness beyond the careful way she avoided looking toward the door. Jack was building towers with blocks on the floor where my coffee table used to sit, his laughter floating through the glass like a memory of happier times. "They look fine to me," I said, holding up the small gifts I had wrapped carefully in newspaper because wrapping paper was now a luxury beyond my reach. "Children can be deceptive," Rebecca replied, already moving to close the door. "We can't risk exposing you to illness at your age. Your immune system isn't what it used to be. My age. My failing immune system." She wielded my mortality like a weapon, using my own vulnerability to justify keeping me away from the children who had once been the brightest lights in my increasingly dark world. I stood on the porch holding gifts for grandchildren I wasn't allowed to see, feeling more invisible than I had ever imagined possible. The second Sunday brought a different excuse. The family had decided to visit Rebecca's parents, a trip planned so suddenly that they couldn't possibly reschedule. The third Sunday, Daniel answered the door himself, looking uncomfortable but resolute. "Mom, this isn't working," he said, not inviting me inside despite the rain beginning to fall. "The kids are confused about the situation, and Rebecca thinks it's better if we have some space while everyone adjusts to the new arrangements." Space. Adjustments. New arrangements. He spoke about the destruction of our family bonds as if they were minor household renovations, temporary inconveniences that would resolve themselves with time and patience. "I'm their grandmother," I said, rain soaking through my thin jacket. "I've been part of their lives since they were born. You can't just erase that because it's inconvenient for your wife." "You're being dramatic," Daniel replied, his voice carrying the weary tone of someone forced to deal with an unreasonable person. "This isn't about erasing anything. It's about creating healthy boundaries and helping everyone move forward." Healthy boundaries. The phrase sounded like something from Rebecca's psychology magazines, the kind of pop wisdom that turns cruelty into self-care and abandonment into personal growth. I wondered if they had practiced this conversation, rehearsed the words that would make my exclusion sound reasonable and necessary rather than heartlessly calculated. The rain grew heavier as we stood there, father and abandoned mother, pretending this was a normal family discussion rather than the final severing of bonds that had once seemed unbreakable. Daniel's discomfort was obvious. He shifted his weight from foot to foot, avoided eye contact, kept glancing back toward the house where his real family waited. but it wasn't enough to make him reconsider. Shame, apparently, was easier to bear than his wife's disapproval. "When will I see them again?" I asked, hating how small and pleading my voice sounded. "We'll figure something out," he said, which we both knew meant never. Maybe when things settle down, when everyone's had time to process the changes. I drove away that day understanding that I had lost more than a house. I had lost my place in the story of my own family, become a supporting character who could be written out whenever her presence complicated the plot. The children would grow up with vague memories of a grandmother who had simply faded away, replaced by whatever story Rebecca chose to tell about family dynamics and necessary separations. The assisted living facility Rebecca had recommended was a beige building surrounded by parking lots and carefully maintained landscaping that looked cheerful from a distance, but felt sterile up close. I visited once, letting the administrator show me through hallways that smelled of disinfectant and resignation, past common rooms where elderly residents sat watching television programs they didn't seem to be following. "We have activities every day," the woman explained with professional enthusiasm. "Bingo on Mondays, arts and crafts on Wednesdays, movie nights on Fridays. Our residents form wonderful friendships and really enjoy the social aspects of community living." The room they showed me was small and white, with a single window overlooking the parking lot. It came furnished with institutional furniture designed for durability rather than comfort. A narrow bed, a plastic chair, a dresser that looked like it belonged in a college dormitory. The walls were bare, waiting for whatever personal touches might make the space feel less like a holding cell for people whose families had decided they were no longer manageable. "The deposit is $3,000, the administrator continued, plus first month's rent. We also require a guarantor to co-sign the lease, someone financially responsible who can ensure payments continue even if circumstances change." $3,000. I had exactly $423 in my checking account, the remainder of my last Social Security payment after buying gas and the cheapest food I could find. The guarantor requirement was clearly designed for families who wanted to warehouse inconvenient relatives while maintaining some legal protection for the facility. "I'll need to think about it," I said, though we both understood I would never return. That night, parked behind a 24-hour diner where the neon sign flickered like a dying heartbeat, I calculated my options with the brutal honesty that poverty demands. My Social Security provided $840 per month, barely enough to cover food and gas, certainly insufficient for rent anywhere decent. I could apply for assistance programs, but the waiting lists stretched for months or years, and most required permanent addresses I no longer possessed. The car had become my entire world: bedroom, closet, dining room, and refuge. I had learned to fold my clothes efficiently, to ration food so meals lasted longer, to find public restrooms that offered soap and paper towels for basic hygiene. My driver's license still listed the beach house address, a cruel reminder every time I needed identification that I was living like a ghost in my own life. Some nights, other displaced people would park nearby. Men, mostly. Veterans and addicts and workers whose industries had disappeared, leaving them stranded between the lives they used to have and whatever came next. We maintained careful distances, respecting each other's privacy while acknowledging our shared circumstances with subtle nods, and the understanding that judgment was a luxury none of us could afford. I began spending days at the public library, partly for the air conditioning and clean bathrooms, but mostly because books had always been my escape when reality became unbearable. The librarians were kind but professionally distant, treating me with the gentle courtesy reserved for patrons whose circumstances made everyone slightly uncomfortable. It was there, reading in a corner chair by the window, that I overheard a conversation that changed everything. Two women at the computer station were discussing property records and inheritance laws, researching something for a family dispute involving elderly parents and adult children who wanted access to assets before their time. "The key is getting them to sign voluntarily," one woman said, her voice carrying the casual cruelty of someone discussing dinner plans rather than financial manipulation. "Elder law attorneys know all the tricks. You just have to present it as protection and planning rather than what it really is." I listened with growing recognition as they described tactics identical to what Daniel and Rebecca had used: the hospital visits during vulnerable moments, The complex paperwork presented as routine protection, the careful timing that prevented second thoughts or outside consultation. This wasn't an isolated case of family betrayal. It was a pattern, a method, possibly even a business model. That evening, instead of driving aimlessly until exhaustion forced me to find a parking spot for the night, I sat in the library until closing time, reading everything I could find about elder fraud, property law, and the legal remedies available to people who had been systematically robbed by their own families. For the first time since that terrible day when my keys wouldn't fit my own front door, I felt something other than despair. It wasn't hope exactly, not yet, but it was curiosity. And curiosity, I was beginning to remember, had always been the first step toward the kind of stubborn determination that had carried me through divorce and single motherhood, and 20 years of building something beautiful from nothing. They thought they had won. They thought I was broken, defeated, too old and weak and ashamed to fight back. They had counted on my love for them to keep me silent, on my fear of causing family drama to prevent me from seeking justice. But as I sat in that library chair, surrounded by law books and legal precedents, I began to understand that sometimes love means refusing to let people destroy themselves with cruelty. Sometimes the most loving thing a mother can do is teach her child that actions have consequences, even when those lessons come later than anyone hoped. The breaking point came on Emma's 9th birthday. I had remembered the date, of course. October 15th, the day I had rushed to the hospital 8 years ago to hold my first grandchild. Tears streaming down my face as I whispered promises about all the adventures we would share. I had saved $27 over 2 weeks, buying ingredients to make her favorite chocolate cake from scratch, the recipe my own mother had taught me during my childhood, when birthdays were celebrated with love rather than expensive parties. I drove to the house that afternoon, carrying the cake in a box I had carefully cleaned and decorated with ribbons salvaged from an old gift bag. The windows glowed with warm light, and I could hear laughter floating across the dunes, the sound of a family celebration in full swing. Rebecca's parents were there, along with what looked like half of Emma's class from school, children I had never met running around the backyard where I used to plant flowers with small hands eager to help Grandma make things grow. I knocked on the door with trembling fingers, holding my modest offering like a peace treaty. When Rebecca answered, her face transformed from party hostess joy to cold annoyance in the space of a heartbeat. Behind her, I could see Emma surrounded by a mountain of expensive gifts, an iPad, designer clothes, toys that cost more than my monthly food budget. "Victoria," Rebecca said, not bothering to lower her voice despite the children playing nearby. "What are you doing here?" "It's Emma's birthday," I said, holding up the cake box. "I made her favorite, chocolate with buttercream frosting. She always helped me make it when she was little." "You can't just show up uninvited," Rebecca replied, blocking the doorway with her body. "This is a private family celebration. We have guests." Through the open door, Emma looked up from her pile of presents and saw me standing there. Her face lit up with the pure joy that only children can radiate, and she started to run toward me calling Grandma Victoria, before Rebecca's sharp voice stopped her mid-stride. "Emma, come back here right now," Rebecca commanded. Grandma Victoria was just leaving. The confusion on Emma's face broke something fundamental inside my chest. She looked between me and her mother, trying to understand why the grandmother who had once been her favorite person was suddenly unwelcome at her birthday party. Her small shoulders drooped as she slowly returned to her presence, but I caught her glancing back at me with questions her 8-year-old mind couldn't articulate. "Please," I whispered to Rebecca, my voice barely audible above the party noise. "Just let me give her the cake. It's her birthday." "She has a cake," Rebecca said, pointing to an elaborate 3-tier creation from an expensive bakery, decorated with fondant flowers and edible glitter. "She doesn't need yours." The words hit like physical blows. Not just the rejection, but the casual dismissal of everything my gift represented. The hours spent measuring ingredients I could barely afford, the love baked into every layer, the desperate hope that something homemade might matter more than something purchased. My cake, with its slightly lopsided frosting and hand-piped roses that weren't quite perfect, looked pathetic next to the professional creation dominating the dining room table. "Daniel," I called past Rebecca, hoping my son might intervene, might remember all the birthday cakes I had made for him during the lean years when bakery treats were unimaginable luxuries. He appeared in the doorway, looking uncomfortable but resolute. "Mom, you need to go," he said, his voice barely recognizable as belonging to the boy I had raised. "We talked about this. Surprise visits aren't appropriate anymore." "It's not a surprise," I said, my voice breaking. "It's her birthday. I'm her grandmother. I've never missed one of her birthdays." "Well, you're missing this one," Rebecca said, already closing the door. "Maybe next year we can work something out if you call ahead and make proper arrangements." The door closed with a soft click that sounded like thunder in my ears. I stood there holding a chocolate cake while my granddaughter's birthday party continued without me, listening to laughter and music from a celebration where my presence was not just unwanted, but actively harmful to the family's happiness. I walked back to my car on unsteady legs, placed the cake carefully on the passenger seat, and drove to the beach where I used to take Emma to collect shells. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that Emma had always called God's paint box. I sat on a piece of driftwood and ate birthday cake with my fingers, tasting salt from tears I couldn't stop shedding. That night, parked behind a closed gas station, I reached the lowest point of my 68 years, lower than the day my husband left me for his secretary, lower than the terrifying weeks of medical uncertainty, lower even than the moment I discovered my keys no longer worked in my own front door. This was the night I considered whether continuing to fight was worth the energy it required. The cake sat on my dashboard, half-eaten and growing stale, a symbol of love that had nowhere to go. I thought about the assisted living facility with its institutional furniture and bingo games, wondered if accepting defeat might be easier than enduring more rejection from people I had sacrificed everything to love. Maybe Rebecca was right. Maybe I was too old, too inconvenient, too much of a burden for modern family life. My reflection in the rearview mirror showed a woman I barely recognized. Gray hair that needed cutting, clothes that were clean but clearly came from thrift stores, lines around my eyes that spoke of worry rather than laughter. When had I become this person? When had I stopped being Victoria the fighter and become Victoria the victim? But as I sat there in the darkness, something unexpected happened. Instead of sinking deeper into despair, I felt a strange calm settling over me like fog rolling in from the ocean. The tears stopped, the shaking in my hands quieted, and for the first time in weeks, my mind felt clear and focused. I pulled out the notebook I had started keeping, the one where I recorded every conversation, every excuse, every lie they had told me. I wrote down everything about Emma's birthday, the expensive gifts, the professional cake, the casual cruelty of turning away a grandmother who had never missed an important moment in that child's life. I wrote until my hand cramped, documenting not just the facts but the feelings, the systematic way they were erasing me from family history. Then I opened the glove compartment and pulled out the folder I had been accumulating, copies of documents from the library, printouts of legal precedents, phone numbers for elder law attorneys who specialized in cases like mine. I had been collecting this information for weeks, telling myself it was just research, just something to occupy my mind during the long days when libraries offered more comfort than anywhere else. But sitting there with Emma's birthday cake growing stale and my granddaughter's confused face burned into my memory, I realized this wasn't just research anymore. This was preparation. This was the ammunition I would need for a war I hadn't asked for, but could no longer avoid fighting. They had counted on my love to keep me silent. They had assumed my shame would prevent me from exposing their cruelty to public scrutiny. They had gambled that grief would make me compliant, that poverty would make me grateful for whatever scraps of contact they chose to offer. But they had forgotten something important about the woman who had raised Daniel alone, who had built a house with her own hands, who had survived cancer scares and financial disasters, and the particular loneliness that comes from being discarded by someone you trusted with your heart. They had forgotten that Victoria Martinez didn't give up easily, and they were about to remember. The next morning, I made my first phone call to an attorney's office. My voice was steady as I explained my situation to the receptionist, requesting a consultation about elder fraud and property theft. "Yes," I said. I understood there might be fees involved. "Yes," I was prepared to discuss payment options. And yes, I had documentation. As I hung up the phone, I looked at Emma's birthday cake one last time before throwing it away. The sweetness had turned bitter, but the memory of making it, the hope and love I had poured into every ingredient, that would fuel what came next. I wasn't invisible anymore. I wasn't a problem to be managed or a burden to be warehoused. I was a woman who had been robbed, and I was going to prove it. The law office of Sandra Morales was nothing like the imposing buildings I had imagined. Located in a converted house near downtown, it felt more like visiting a trusted friend than consulting with an attorney. Sandra herself was perhaps 55, with silver-streaked hair and the kind of calm confidence that comes from years of helping people navigate their worst moments. "Mrs. Martinez," she said, reviewing the thick folder I had compiled over weeks of research and documentation, "I want you to know that what happened to you is more common than most people realize. Elder financial abuse often goes unreported because victims are ashamed or afraid of causing family problems." She spread my documents across her desk. Copies of the hospital papers I had signed, bank records showing the property transfer, photographs I had managed to take of my belongings in donation bags before they disappeared forever. Each piece of evidence told part of a story I was only beginning to understand in its full scope. "The timing is particularly telling," Sandra continued, pointing to dates on various documents. "The property transfer occurred while you were hospitalized, during a period when you were medically vulnerable and financially dependent on your son for transportation and support. That creates what we call undue influence, a legal concept that recognizes when someone uses their position of trust to manipulate another person's decisions. Undue influence." The phrase gave a name to something I had felt but couldn't articulate. The sense that my signature on those documents hadn't been freely given, that my trust had been weaponized against me during my weakest moment. "The challenge," Sandra explained gently, "is that your son and daughter-in-law were careful. They didn't forge documents or steal outright. They used legal mechanisms, properly executed paperwork, legitimate channels that make their actions technically lawful, even if morally reprehensible." My heart sank. Legal but immoral seemed like the story of my entire situation. Losing my home through proper procedures, being denied access to grandchildren through reasonable-sounding boundaries, becoming homeless through a series of decisions that looked defensible on paper. "However," Sandra continued, her tone shifting in a way that made me lean forward, "there are several factors working in your favor. First, the rapid timeline between your medical crisis and the property transfer. Second, the complete erasure of your belongings without your knowledge or consent. Third, the systematic denial of access to your grandchildren, which suggests their motivations weren't purely about your welfare." She opened a different folder, revealing documents I didn't recognize. "I've been making some preliminary inquiries about your son's financial situation. Did you know he and Rebecca filed for bankruptcy 2 years ago? That they've been struggling with credit card debt and a failed business venture?" The information hit me like cold water. Daniel had never mentioned financial problems. If anything, Rebecca's designer clothes and expensive lifestyle had suggested prosperity rather than desperation. But as Sandra laid out the evidence, court filings, credit reports, loan applications, a different picture emerged of a couple drowning in debt who saw my property as their lifeline. "Your beach house has appreciated significantly since you purchased it," Sandra explained. "Current market value is approximately $400,000, with only $60,000 remaining on the mortgage. For someone facing bankruptcy, that equity represents a solution to immediate financial problems. $400,000. I had paid $85,000 for that lot 20 years ago, investing every penny of my divorce settlement into what real estate agents had called undevelopable coastal property. Through my own labor and determination, I had created something valuable that could have secured my retirement for decades. "What are my options?" I asked, though I was afraid to hope for answers that might actually help. "We can challenge the property transfer on grounds of undue influence," Sandra said. "We can also pursue charges for elder financial abuse, which is a criminal matter in addition to the civil case. The systematic disposal of your personal property without consent constitutes theft, regardless of who held the deed at the time. Criminal charges. The possibility that Daniel and Rebecca might face legal consequences for their actions felt both terrifying and necessary. I had raised my son to understand right from wrong, to respect other people's rights and property. If he had forgotten those lessons, perhaps the law could remind him. Over the following weeks, Sandra and I built a case with the methodical patience of archaeologists uncovering buried truth. We documented every conversation, every denied visit, every excuse that had kept me away from my grandchildren. We traced the timeline of my medical treatment and the documents I had signed while frightened and vulnerable. We established the pattern of deception that had led to my homelessness. The most damaging evidence came from an unexpected source. While reviewing Rebecca's social media accounts, Sandra discovered posts from the weeks during my hospitalization, photos of her shopping for furniture and home decor, excited updates about finally having space to make the house our own, countdown posts to move-in day that were dated before I had even been discharged from the hospital. "She was planning your displacement while you were fighting for your life," Sandra said, showing me screenshots of Rebecca's posts. "This demonstrates premeditation, that your medical crisis was seen as an opportunity rather than a family emergency requiring support." The posts were nauseating to read. Rebecca described my furniture as outdated, and my decorating choices as depressing old lady stuff that needed to go. She shared before and after photos of my living room, celebrating the transformation that had erased every trace of my existence. Worst of all, she had posted pictures of my grandmother's quilt and other family heirlooms with captions like, "Amazing what people save. Some serious decluttering needed here." My grandmother's quilt, which had covered 5 generations of women in my family, had been reduced to clutter requiring disposal. The photo albums chronicling Daniel's entire childhood, the books I had collected over decades, the small treasures that held memories too precious for any monetary value, all dismissed as junk by a woman who measured worth in retail prices and Instagram likes. But there was something else in those posts, something Sandra's trained eye caught that I had missed. In the background of several photos, clearly visible on my old kitchen table, were the original property documents, the ones I had signed during my hospitalization. Rebecca had photographed them accidentally, while celebrating her redecorating progress, creating a timestamp that proved the documents existed in their possession weeks before they claimed to have filed them. "This is significant," Sandra explained. "It suggests they held the signed documents for an extended period, possibly to ensure you were too displaced and disoriented to seek legal help before the transfer became final." That level of calculation strengthens our case considerably. As we prepared for what Sandra called the confrontation phase, I found myself changing in ways I hadn't expected. The grief and shame that had consumed me for months were gradually being replaced by something harder and more focused. Not anger exactly, though that was certainly present. Something more like clarity. I began driving past the house again, not to torture myself with what I had lost, but to observe and document. I noted the expensive cars in the driveway, the professional landscaping that had replaced my careful garden, the security system that had been installed to protect assets that had originally been mine. I photographed the changes they had made, the improvements financed with equity stolen from my life's work. During one of these surveillance visits, I saw Emma playing alone in the backyard while Rebecca talked on her phone inside. My granddaughter looked smaller than I remembered, less joyful, moving through the space with the careful attention of a child who had learned that spontaneous happiness might be interrupted or corrected. She was building a sandcastle near the dunes, using techniques I had taught her during our beach walks. For a moment, watching her small hands shape towers and walls with the patience of an engineer, I could pretend nothing had changed. But then Rebecca appeared at the window, noticed Emma's proximity to the beach path where I might be walking, and called her inside with the sharp tone of someone preventing potential problems. That night, parked in my usual spot behind the closed diner, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible during my darkest moments. I wasn't fighting this battle just to reclaim my property or restore my relationship with my grandchildren. I was fighting it to teach them, Daniel, Rebecca, and eventually Emma and Jack, that actions have consequences, that cruelty dressed up as practicality is still cruelty, and that love sometimes means refusing to let people destroy themselves with behaviors they'll regret for the rest of their lives. My phone contained Sandra's number, ready to be called when I was prepared to set events in motion that couldn't be stopped or reversed. The legal papers were prepared, the evidence compiled, the strategy agreed upon. All that remained was my decision to proceed. But I wasn't the same woman who had stood on her own doorstep with keys that no longer fit. I wasn't the broken grandmother who had been turned away from a birthday party while holding a homemade cake. I was Victoria Martinez, and I had remembered something important about myself. I didn't just survive difficult times. I learned from them. And I was about to teach my family the difference between a woman who could be discarded and a woman who chose when to reveal her strength. The morning I decided to move forward with legal action, I woke before dawn and drove to the beach where my house sat like a stolen jewel against the horizon. The sun was just beginning to paint the sky in shades of coral and gold, the same colors that had greeted me every morning for 20 years when this place belonged to me. I sat in my car and watched the waves roll in with their eternal rhythm, gathering strength for what would either restore my life or destroy what remained of my family forever. Sandra had warned me that once we filed the papers, there would be no going back. Daniel and Rebecca would be forced to respond, to hire their own attorneys, to face criminal charges alongside the civil case. The local newspapers might pick up the story. Elderly woman fights family for stolen home, and the private shame that had consumed me for months would become public knowledge. "Are you prepared for that?" Sandra had asked during our final preparation meeting. "For the possibility that this will end your relationship with your son permanently? That you might never see your grandchildren again?" The question had haunted me through sleepless nights in my car. But now, watching the sunrise over the property I had built with my own hands, I knew the answer with absolute certainty. My relationship with Daniel was already over. It had ended the moment he chose to hide behind his wife's cruelty rather than protect the woman who had sacrificed everything to raise him. My access to Emma and Jack was already gone, stolen as efficiently as my furniture and photographs and grandmother's quilt. I had nothing left to lose except my dignity, and that was something I refused to surrender. The papers were served on a Tuesday morning while I watched from the public beach access point. The process server, a young woman with a professional demeanor, knocked on my former front door and handed the documents to Rebecca, whose face went through a fascinating series of expressions: confusion, realization, and finally, a cold fury that was visible even from my distant vantage point. Within an hour, my phone rang. Daniel's voice was higher than usual, strained with disbelief and anger. "Mom, what the hell do you think you're doing?" he demanded, skipping any pretense of civilized conversation. "Suing your own family? Having us served with legal papers like we're criminals?" "You are criminals," I replied, my voice calmer than I had expected. "You stole my house, my belongings, and my relationship with my grandchildren. You manipulated a sick woman into signing documents she didn't understand. That's elder abuse, Daniel. It's illegal." "We didn't steal anything." His voice cracked with indignation. "You signed those papers voluntarily. We have witnesses. This whole thing is ridiculous, and you're going to embarrass yourself and destroy this family over a misunderstanding." A misunderstanding. Even now, faced with legal consequences for their actions, he was trying to minimize what they had done, to reframe systematic theft as a simple miscommunication that could be resolved with better intentions and clearer discussions. "Where are my grandmother's quilts, Daniel?" I asked quietly. "Where are the photo albums from your childhood? Where is the rocking chair I nursed you in when you had pneumonia at age 3? The silence stretched long enough for me to hear Rebecca's voice in the background, sharp and urgent, though I couldn't make out the words. "Those were just things, Mom," Daniel said finally. "Old stuff that was cluttering up the house. We needed space for our family, for our life. You're making this about material possessions when it should be about what's best for everyone." "What's best for everyone?" I repeated. "Does that include making your mother homeless? Does that include denying your children access to their grandmother? Does that include lying to a cancer patient in a hospital bed?" Another long pause. When Daniel spoke again, his voice had shifted to the pleading tone he'd used as a child when caught in lies too big to deny. "We can work this out," he said, You don't need lawyers and court battles. We're family. We can find a solution that works for everyone. I tried family solutions for months, I reminded him. I begged. I pleaded. I stood in the rain asking to see my grandchildren. The time for family solutions ended when you changed the locks on my house. That afternoon, Sandra called with news that was both satisfying and troubling. They've hired counsel, she reported, a firm that specializes in estate planning and asset protection. Expensive attorneys who typically work for wealthy families trying to shield money from taxes or creditors. What does that mean for our case? It means they're taking this seriously, which suggests they know their actions were legally questionable. But it also means they have resources I wasn't aware of. Where would a couple in bankruptcy get money for high-end legal representation? The answer came 2 days later, when Sandra's investigator uncovered the source of Daniel and Rebecca's newfound financial stability. They had taken out a substantial home equity loan against my property, using my stolen house as collateral for borrowing that had paid off their debts and financed their legal defense against my claims. They're using your own property to fund the lawyers fighting your attempt to reclaim it, Sandra explained, her voice tight with controlled anger. It's particularly audacious, even by the standards of financial abuse cases I've handled. The irony was so cruel it almost felt like dark comedy. My beach house, built with my labor and financed with my divorce settlement, was now generating the money being used to keep me homeless and estranged from my grandchildren. Every payment on their legal fees came from equity I had created through 20 years of careful maintenance and improvement. But Sandra's investigator had uncovered something else, something that changed the entire landscape of our case. While researching the home equity loan, they discovered that Daniel and Rebecca had lied on their application about the circumstances of the property transfer. They had claimed I was deceased, providing forged death certificates to expedite the borrowing process and avoid questions about my consent. This moves us into criminal fraud territory, Sandra explained. Filing false documents with a bank, especially death certificates, is a federal crime. The local prosecutor's office will be very interested in this information. Forged death certificates. They hadn't just stolen my home and belongings. They had literally erased me from existence, declaring me dead to financial institutions while I slept in my car, behind gas stations, and searched for ways to survive on Social Security income. The depth of their deception was breathtaking in its completeness. That evening, I sat in my car looking at the house that glowed with warm light against the darkness, wondering if the people inside understood how deeply they had committed themselves to a path that could only end in destruction. Did Daniel remember the bedtime stories I had read to him? The sacrifices I had made to ensure he had opportunities I'd never had? Did Rebecca consider, even briefly, how her children would feel when they learned their mother had declared their grandmother dead for financial convenience? The next morning brought another phone call, this time from Rebecca herself. Her voice was different from her usual controlled politeness, sharper, more desperate, with edges that cut through her practiced composure. "Victoria, this has gone far enough," she said without preamble. "You're destroying this family with your selfishness. Daniel is devastated. The children are confused. You need to drop this lawsuit and let us move on with our lives." "The children are confused because you told them I was dead," I replied. "How exactly did you explain filing death certificates for someone who was still calling to ask about birthday parties?" The silence that followed was so complete I wondered if she had hung up. When she spoke again, her voice carried a cold fury that revealed more about her true nature than months of polite dismissal ever had. "You have no idea what you're up against," she said. "Daniel chose me over you a long time ago. He chose our future over your past. Fighting us will only prove that you're exactly the bitter, vindictive old woman I always said you were." "Perhaps," I agreed calmly. "But I'm a bitter, vindictive old woman with excellent legal representation and documented evidence of criminal fraud. I think I'll take my chances." The call ended with a sharp click that echoed in my car like a gunshot. I sat for a moment, processing the conversation and what it revealed about the people I had once considered family. Rebecca's mask had finally slipped completely, showing the calculating cruelty that had always lurked beneath her surface concern for my welfare. But there was something else in that conversation, something that gave me hope, desperation, fear. The recognition that their carefully constructed house of lies was beginning to collapse under the weight of legal scrutiny. They were scared now, and scared people make mistakes. They would overreach, say too much, try too hard to control a narrative that was already slipping away from them. All I had to do was wait and watch and let them destroy themselves with the same systematic thoroughness they had once used to destroy me. The hunters had become the hunted, and they were just beginning to understand how dangerous their prey had always been. The courtroom was smaller than I had imagined, with wood paneling that had darkened with age and fluorescent lights that cast harsh shadows across faces already tense with anticipation. I sat beside Sandra, wearing the only decent dress I still owned, navy blue with a small tear near the hem that I had carefully mended, while across the aisle, Daniel and Rebecca huddled with their team of expensive attorneys like generals planning a final assault. Judge Margaret Chen, a woman perhaps my age with silver hair and intelligent eyes that missed nothing, reviewed the case files with the methodical attention of someone who had seen every variation of family betrayal that greed could inspire. The preliminary hearing was meant to address the criminal charges, the forged death certificates and fraudulent loan applications that had elevated this from a civil dispute to a matter requiring prosecution. "This is highly unusual," Judge Chen said, looking directly at Daniel and Rebecca's lead attorney. "In 40 years on the bench, I've rarely seen cases where alleged victims of estate planning were declared dead while still very much alive and pursuing legal remedies." Rebecca's attorney, a man whose $1,000 suit couldn't quite hide his obvious discomfort, cleared his throat nervously. "Your Honor, my clients maintain that the death certificates were filed due to a clerical error at the hospital. There was confusion during Mrs. Martinez's extended medical treatment and—" "Mr. Peterson," Judge Chen interrupted, her voice carrying the particular authority that comes from decades of distinguishing truth from fabrication. "I have the hospital records here. Mrs. Martinez was treated as an outpatient for routine cancer screening. She was never unconscious, never in a coma, never declared dead by any medical professional. Yet these certificates bear signatures claiming multiple physicians pronounced her deceased. Are you suggesting the entire medical staff at Coastal General Hospital suffered from simultaneous clerical confusion?" The silence that followed was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. Daniel stared at his hands, his face pale beneath the fluorescent lights, while Rebecca maintained her composure with visible effort. Her jaw was clenched so tightly, I wondered if her teeth might crack from the pressure. "Furthermore," Judge Chen continued, consulting another document, "bank records show that within hours of filing these death certificates, your clients applied for and received a home equity loan of $250,000. They used these funds to pay off existing debts, purchase luxury items, and, ironically, retain your services to fight the very woman they had declared dead." Sandra leaned forward slightly, her voice respectful but firm. "Your Honor, we believe this demonstrates a pattern of systematic financial abuse designed to isolate and impoverish an elderly woman while enriching the perpetrators. The speed and coordination of these actions suggests extensive premeditation." Daniel's attorney attempted damage control. "Your Honor, these are complex family dynamics involving legitimate concerns about elder care and property management. Mr. Morrison was acting in what he believed were his mother's best interests. By declaring her dead," Judge Chen's eyebrows rose. "Mr. Hayes, I'm curious how you plan to argue that filing fraudulent death certificates serves anyone's best interests, except those seeking to inherit property before the owner has actually deceased." The hearing continued for 2 hours, during which Sandra presented our evidence with surgical precision. The timeline of my hospitalization and the document signings. The social media posts showing Rebecca's celebration of my displacement. The bank records proving they had used my property as collateral against loans they couldn't otherwise qualify for. The systematic disposal of my belongings while I was receiving medical treatment. But the most damaging testimony came from an unexpected source. Emma's teacher, Mrs. Williams, had been subpoenaed to testify about conversations she'd had with my granddaughter following my sudden disappearance from family events. "Emma became withdrawn after Thanksgiving," Mrs. Williams explained, her voice gentle but clear. She kept asking why Grandma Victoria had stopped coming to school events and birthday parties. When I asked her mother about it, Mrs. Morrison told me that Victoria had passed away suddenly. The courtroom was silent, except for the sound of the court reporter's fingers flying across her keyboard. Did Emma seem to accept this explanation? Sandra asked. Not at all, Mrs. Williams replied. She said she had seen her grandmother driving past the house several times, that Grandma Victoria waved to her from her car. When Emma told her mother this, Mrs. Morrison said Emma was confused. That grief sometimes makes children imagine they see deceased relatives. I watched Daniel's face as his daughter's teacher described how Rebecca had gaslit an 8-year-old child, convincing her that her own eyes couldn't be trusted when they showed her beloved grandmother was still alive. His expression moved from discomfort to horror as he realized the full scope of what his wife had done to protect their theft. This psychological manipulation of a minor, Judge Chen observed, making notes on her legal pad, adds another dimension to these charges. We're not just talking about financial fraud, but emotional abuse of children who were deliberately deceived about their grandmother's well-being. During the lunch recess, I saw Daniel in the courthouse hallway, standing alone while Rebecca spoke urgently with their attorneys near the elevators. He looked older than his 36 years, his face bearing the weight of consequences he was only beginning to understand. For a moment, our eyes met across the marble corridor. I saw something there that might have been regret, or perhaps just fear of the prison sentence he was facing. But when Rebecca noticed our exchange and moved to his side, his expression hardened again into the mask of justified indignation he'd worn throughout this entire ordeal. The afternoon session brought more devastating revelations. Sandra's forensic accountant presented evidence that Daniel and Rebecca had been planning my displacement for over a year, researching assisted living facilities and elder law attorneys long before my cancer scare provided the opportunity they needed. They had already selected and toured the facility where they intended to place Mrs. Martinez, the accountant testified. Bank records show they made a deposit to hold a room 6 months before her medical treatment began. 6 months. While I had been planning garden improvements and looking forward to another peaceful summer at the beach, they had been calculating how to remove me from my own life. Every family dinner, every holiday celebration, every moment when I had felt grateful for their presence in my life had been conducted under false pretenses by people who were counting down the days until they could legally steal everything I owned. But the moment that changed everything came when Judge Chen addressed Daniel directly. Mr. Morrison, she said, her voice carrying the weight of disappointed authority. You've sat quietly while serious criminal charges have been leveled against you. Do you have anything to say about these allegations before I make my preliminary rulings? Daniel stood slowly, his expensive suit unable to disguise the fact that he looked like a man drowning in consequences he'd never imagined. For a long moment, he stared at me across the courtroom, and I saw in his eyes the boy I had raised, the child who had once run to me for comfort when the world seemed too big and frightening to navigate alone. Your Honor, he said, his voice barely audible. I thought we were doing the right thing. My wife said my mother was getting too old to live alone, that the property was too valuable to leave unprotected. I trusted her judgment about what was best for everyone. Rebecca's hand shot out to grip his arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his sleeve with enough force to leave marks. But Daniel gently removed her hand and continued speaking. I realize now that I was wrong, he said, each word seeming to cost him enormous effort. I let my fear about my mother's age and my concerns about our financial situation cloud my judgment about what was right. I hurt the woman who sacrificed everything to raise me, and I taught my children that love doesn't matter when money is involved. The courtroom was so quiet, I could hear the heating system cycling through the vents. Rebecca's face had gone white with fury, her carefully constructed defense crumbling as her husband confessed to crimes she had convinced him were justifiable family planning. I want to make this right, Daniel continued, tears streaming down his face. I don't know if my mother can ever forgive me, but I want to try to undo the damage I've caused. Judge Chen nodded slowly, making notes while she processed this unexpected development. Mr. Morrison, are you prepared to cooperate fully with the court in resolving this matter? To make full restitution and accept whatever legal consequences your actions have earned? Yes, Your Honor. Daniel said, his voice growing stronger with each word. I am. That was the moment Rebecca's composure finally shattered completely. She leaped to her feet, her voice cutting through the courtroom like a blade. He doesn't speak for me, she shouted, ignoring her attorney's attempts to restrain her. I won't let that bitter old woman destroy everything we've built. She's trying to steal our children's future out of spite. Mrs. Morrison. Judge Chen's voice carried the sharp authority of someone accustomed to maintaining order. You will sit down and remain silent, or you will be held in contempt. But Rebecca was beyond caring about contempt charges. Years of careful manipulation and calculated cruelty poured out in a torrent of rage that revealed the true nature she had hidden behind practiced smiles and concerned daughter-in-law performances. She never deserved that house, Rebecca screamed, her face contorted with fury. She's a nobody, a grocery store clerk who got lucky in a divorce. We have education, we have ambition, we have plans that matter. She was just going to die in that house and waste everything. The silence that followed was deafening. Rebecca had just confessed, in open court, to the premeditated theft of my property based on nothing more than her belief that she deserved my life's work more than I did. Judge Chen's gavel came down with finality. Mrs. Morrison, you are in contempt of court. Bailiff, please escort her to a holding cell where she can consider the wisdom of her outburst. As Rebecca was led away, still shouting about the injustice of her situation, I realized that justice had finally arrived not through careful legal strategy, but through the simple truth that cruelty eventually destroys itself. The woman who had stolen my home, convinced my grandchildren I was dead, and turned my son against me, had just confessed her crimes in front of a judge, a jury, and a courtroom full of witnesses. Sometimes the best revenge is simply giving people enough rope to hang themselves with their own words. The sun was setting over my beach house when I finally came home. 3 months after Rebecca's courtroom breakdown, 2 months after Daniel's guilty plea to elder fraud charges, and 1 month after the divorce papers were filed, I stood once again on the wooden deck I had built with my own hands, watching the waves roll in with their eternal rhythm of renewal. The house felt different, not just because of the changes Rebecca had made during her brief occupation, but because I had changed. The woman who walked through these rooms now carried scars that would never fully heal, but also a strength she had forgotten she possessed. Every corner that had been emptied of my belongings now told a story of survival rather than loss, of justice rather than victimization. Daniel had kept his promise to make restitution. The forged documents had been corrected. The fraudulent loans repaid from the sale of assets Rebecca had purchased with stolen money. My grandmother's quilt, rescued from a donation center 3 counties away, once again covered the bed where 5 generations of women in my family had dreamed their dreams. The photo albums, found in Rebecca's storage unit along with other donated items she had apparently planned to sell, returned my memories to their proper place on rebuilt shelves. But some things could never be fully restored. The rocking chair where I had nursed my son through childhood illnesses remained lost, probably refinished, and sitting in a stranger's nursery where other mothers created the bonds I had once thought were unbreakable. Some of my clothes, books that had been companions through lonely evenings, small treasures accumulated over decades of careful living. These had been scattered to thrift stores and garage sales like seeds from a dandelion, impossible to track and reclaim. The financial settlement had done more than return my property. Rebecca's assets, seized through civil forfeiture, had provided enough money to secure my retirement in ways I had never imagined possible. The expensive jewelry, designer handbags, and luxury items she had purchased with equity stolen from my home were sold at auction, their proceeds deposited into accounts that would ensure I never again faced the terror of homelessness. Justice, I had learned, sometimes comes with compound interest. Daniel served 6 months in minimum security prison, time he used to complete addiction counseling for what his lawyer called a gambling problem that had contributed to his financial desperation. I visited him twice. Conversations that were stilted and careful. 2 people trying to rebuild trust from foundations that had been completely destroyed. I don't expect you to forgive me, he said during our second visit, sitting across from me in a sterile room that smelled of disinfectant and broken promises. I don't even know how to forgive myself, but I want you to know that every day I remember what you sacrificed to raise me, and every day I hate what I became. Forgiveness, I realized, wasn't something that could be given or received like a gift. It was something that grew slowly, carefully, in soil that had been turned over and replanted with different seeds. Maybe someday we would find our way back to each other. Maybe we wouldn't. But the choice would be made from strength rather than desperation, from hope rather than fear. Rebecca was serving 18 months in state prison for multiple counts of fraud, theft, and elder abuse. Her sentence had been enhanced by what the judge called exceptional cruelty, in manipulating her own children to believe their grandmother was dead. I felt no satisfaction in her imprisonment, only a weary relief that she could no longer hurt people who loved unwisely or trusted too completely. The children, Emma and Jack, were living with Rebecca's parents while Daniel rebuilt his life from the wreckage of his poor choices. We saw each other cautiously at first, supervised visits in neutral locations, while court-appointed counselors helped them process the complicated truth about what their mother had done and why their father had allowed it to happen. "Are you really not dead, Grandma Victoria?" Emma had asked during our third meeting, her 8-year-old mind still struggling to reconcile the lies she'd been told with the reality of my presence. "I'm very much alive," I assured her, pulling her onto my lap where she fit as perfectly as she always had. "And I'm never going anywhere again." It was a promise I intended to keep, though I understood now that love alone wasn't enough to guarantee its fulfillment. Love required vigilance, boundaries, and the willingness to fight for relationships worth preserving. It required recognizing the difference between people who deserved trust and people who had simply learned to mimic trustworthiness for their own advantage. The legal victory had been more complete than Sandra and I had dared hope. Beyond the criminal convictions and financial restitution, the family court had awarded me permanent custody rights for the children should Daniel prove unable to provide stable care. Rebecca's parental rights had been terminated after psychological evaluations revealed what the court called a pattern of manipulative behavior that poses ongoing risk to minor children. I didn't want to replace their mother, despite her failures, but I wanted them to know that someone would always fight for them, always choose their welfare over financial convenience, always love them enough to tell them the truth even when lies might be more comfortable. The neighborhood had watched my return with mixtures of curiosity, guilt, and admiration. Some neighbors apologized for their silence during my homelessness, explaining that they hadn't known how to help or hadn't understood the full scope of what was happening. Others simply resumed treating me as they always had, as if the months of my displacement had been an unfortunate intermission in an otherwise normal story. Mrs. Patterson brought me a casserole and an apology. "I should have done something," she said, standing on the porch where I had once begged Rebecca for access to my own home. "I should have called the police or offered you a place to stay. I was a coward." "You were afraid," I corrected gently. "There's a difference. And now you know what you'll do differently if you ever see someone else in similar circumstances." The local newspaper had covered the story with headlines that alternately outraged and inspired readers. "Grandmother fights back against family fraud." "Elder abuse case exposes legal loopholes." "Local woman reclaims stolen home through legal battle." The coverage brought attention to the broader problem of financial abuse targeting older adults, leading to new legislation strengthening protections for vulnerable populations. Sandra had been contacted by families across the state facing similar situations, children who used medical crises to manipulate property transfers, relatives who declared elderly family members incompetent to gain control of assets, spouses who systematically isolated partners from support systems before stealing everything they had worked to build. "Your case opened doors," Sandra told me during our final meeting. "Not just for your own justice, but for hundreds of other people who thought they had no recourse against family members who abused their trust. Sometimes the most important victories are the ones that create possibilities for people you'll never meet, who face battles you'll never witness, but who benefit from precedents established by someone willing to fight when fighting seemed pointless." 6 months after returning home, I was working in my garden when Emma and Jack arrived for their weekly visit. They had begun staying with me every weekend, relationships slowly rebuilding through shared meals, bedtime stories, and beach walks where we collected shells and talked about everything except the complicated adult failures that had separated us. "Grandma Victoria," Jack said, now 5 and full of questions about everything. "Why did Mommy tell us you were dead when you weren't dead?" I paused in my weeding, considering how to answer a question that adults had struggled to understand. "Sometimes people make very bad choices when they're scared or want something that doesn't belong to them," I said finally. "Your mommy made bad choices, and she hurt people who loved her. But that doesn't mean you're bad, or that love isn't real, or that families can't heal from bad choices if everyone works very hard to do better." Emma, now 9 and wiser than her years, nodded solemnly. "Are you going to make bad choices too?" "I'm going to try very hard not to," I promised. "And if I do make mistakes, I'm going to tell you the truth about them and work to fix whatever I broke." That evening, as the children played in the surf while I watched from my deck, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought us all to this point. A year ago, I had been a woman who believed that love and loyalty were enough to protect relationships from destruction. I had trusted blindly, given unconditionally, and expected others to honor the bonds I held sacred simply because I held them sacred. Now I understood that love without boundaries becomes enabling, that trust without verification becomes naive, and that family relationships require the same careful maintenance as any other valuable thing: attention, respect, and the willingness to address problems before they become catastrophic. I was still Daniel's mother, still Emma and Jack's grandmother, still a woman who believed deeply in the power of family bonds. But I was also Victoria Martinez, a person whose worth didn't depend on other people's recognition, whose home belonged to her because she had earned it, whose future was secure because she had learned to protect it. The beach house sat solidly beneath me, its foundations strengthened by repairs and renovations I had made with money reclaimed from those who thought they could steal my life with impunity. The waves continued their eternal dance beyond my windows, indifferent to human drama, but somehow comforting in their consistency. As darkness fell and the children settled into pajamas for another sleepover with their grandmother who had refused to disappear, I made myself a cup of tea and sat in my restored living room, surrounded by photographs and memories and the hard-won peace of someone who had fought for justice and won. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, ongoing healing, and the careful work of rebuilding relationships from stronger materials than blind trust and unconditional sacrifice. But tonight, I was home, truly home, in a place that belonged to me because I had defended it, surrounded by love that had been tested and proven genuine. I had learned that sometimes the most powerful thing a woman can do is refuse to disappear quietly when others decide she's no longer convenient. Sometimes survival means fighting back with every resource available until justice prevails and truth wins. Sometimes the best revenge is simply living well enough to prove that you were never the problem that needed solving.